I am Howard Lauthan. I'm professor of history and director of the Center for Austrian Studies here at the University of Minnesota. And I would like to welcome you also in the name of my colleague, Professor James Parenti, who is director of the Center for German and European Studies. And together we are hosting this event, which for us is the first event of our spring term. We are delighted to have as the first speaker of the 2021 spring program, Professor Suzanne Marchand, who is the Boyd Professor of European Intellectual History at Louisiana State University. Professor Marchand has had a really marvelous and very, very distinguished career teaching at Princeton University and LSU. She's the recipient of a significant number of prizes, awards, and fellowships, including those from the ACLS, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin, the Humboldt Foundation. A very long list of publications. Professor Marchand is the author and editor of more than half a dozen books, including German Orientalism in the Age of Empire, Religion, Race, and Scholarship, which was published with Cambridge University Press in 2009 and won the George Mossey Prize. The latest of her publications is Porcelain, A History from the Heart of Europe with Princeton University Press. Again, we're very pleased to have her today. And today we'll just, let's hand the forum over to her. She'll be speaking on Central European porcelain between mercantilism and the free market. So Professor Marchand, welcome. Thank you for coming. We were hoping that we would be able to get you in person, but one of the advantages of doing Zoom is that she gets to avoid all the nasty weather. Fortunately, today is quite nice, but by this weekend, I was consoling her that if there is some solace in Zoom, you don't have to suffer through our balmy high of -3 on Sunday. So thank you for being with us, and Professor Marchand.
Thank you so much, Howard. It's wonderful to be with you. I'm broadcasting live from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in my very messy office. It's about 60 degrees here. I'll make you jealous with that teaser, but I do wish I could be there with all of you. This is a really special occasion. I was able to come to the University of Minnesota not long ago and had a wonderful time, and would be very happy to come back again in person, and would love to do that. I hope I'm now sharing my screen, and only the screen with the PowerPoint on it. Is that correct, Howard? I'm going to try to read on the screen as well, if that works.
Yes, we do see the sides on the slide as well.
Okay, let's try that.
There, that is just the current slide. Whoops, you went back to the.
Okay. All right, so let me then read from the actual printed text.
Okay.
So as Howard said, this material comes from a recent book. It was a kind of risky and strange experiment for me to move into a new world of scholarship, but it's been a most exciting trip, and I think I've discovered some things certainly that I never knew about, and that I hope will provoke you to investigate some of these same sorts of complexes, not necessarily having to do with porcelain, but in any case, I hope that this will prove interesting. So let's begin the talk. The European porcelain industry was born in Meissen, Saxony, in 1708, at a time in which Central European states were just beginning to recover from the 30 Years' War, and forward-looking rulers were beginning to enhance their courts and to adopt mercantilist tactics to increase their populations and their manufactures. Meissen's secret recipe for the highest quality of porcelain, known as hard paste porcelain, was hit upon by a would-be alchemist who was assisted by a team of science-oriented courtiers. Let's see. Science-oriented courtiers in his castle prison. After many failed experiments funded by Augustus the Strong, our alchemist, Johann Böttcher, did finally find a workable recipe, which did not save him, however, from dying in debt, poisoned by the substances with which he dabbled in his proto-laboratory. Already before his death, Böttcher's secret had been stolen by one of the manufactories we will profile today. And by the 1740s to 60s, there were some 30 porcelain manufactories to be found across the Holy Roman Empire. Despite massive amounts of wastage, these manufactories produced a multitude of luxurious and not so luxurious items, which still today enchant collectors and fill provincial German and Austrian museums. But by the century's last decades, these mercantilist monopolies would be all crumbling, thanks to corruption, rogue competition, insufficient internal demand, enlightened circulation of information, and ingenious smugglers. French revolutionary measures put a further dent into mercantilist manufacturing, but could not finally kill it. Indeed, there remains today one mercantilist, that is state-owned manufactory of porcelain, still operating, and it's the first one, the Meissen works in Saxony. What I want to offer today is a brief examination of this industry in the years after its golden age, hoping thereby to provide something like a microhistory of the long, slow history of the German state's transition from mercantilism to something more like the free market. It's not really the sort of story one expects to be told about porcelain, the 18th century's white gold, as it was known, but I hope that it's one that sparks your interest in a topic which increasingly fascinates me, the history of luxury and semi-luxury production and consumption in Central Europe and its cultural and economic consequences. I've organized today's talk as a tale of two 18th century porcelain manufactories. There we go. One mercantile and royally owned, the Wiener Porcelain Manufaktur, or WPM for short, and the other a privately owned Thuringian firm known as Wallendorf, from which sprang more or less directly the several related firms known for their founders, CM and Lorenz Hutschenreuther. I will allow each of these to strut and fret its time upon the stage before concluding with a brief discussion of changes in luxury consumption across the period between about 1780 and 1840, a period before the great era of machines and railroads that is usually called proto-industrial and largely ignored by Central European economic historians. I hope by taking these two case studies to be able to get down to some of the nitty-gritty in the histories of production and consumption, which to me is where all of the excitement lies, and perhaps also to get us past studies of just heavy industries, coal, iron, and textiles, important as they are, into some other realms and registers. Here too, we might find rich materials to throw new light on such seemingly exhausted topics as the Industrial Revolution and the evolution of the middle classes in the German-speaking states. I will conclude the paper today by departing a bit from economic concerns to cast a glance at changes in consumption over time, to hint a bit at the new directions cultural history might take if we take the production of semi-luxury goods and luxury substitutes more seriously. Today's paper touches on, but cannot examine in detail, related and similarly understudied subjects, such as the origins of modern retailing, the contributions of chemistry to the origins of mass production, and the everyday lives of Central European women. I have a fair number of pictures too, which I hope will spark your imaginations. So we start our case studies with Europe's second oldest porcelain manufactory in Vienna. 8 rocky years after the official founding of the Meissen manufactory in 1710, a Viennese courtier named Clement Incentius de Paquier managed to bribe one of Meissen's few arcanists, or possessors of the secret recipe, to move to the Habsburg capital. Dupaquier received empire-wide monopolistic privileges to make the delicate, extremely expensive commodity at a time that Charles VI was just beginning to promote imperial manufactures. This was by no means unusual, as rulers in this period often offered special privileges and subsidies to promote the founding of new enterprises, especially those concerned with production of armaments and luxury wares. Homemade porcelain, in particular, was seen as an important import substitution, preventing local aristocrats from lining the pockets of the Chinese and the great middlemen of the era, the Dutch. Dupaquier produced porcelain extravagances, such as this one, for more than 2 decades, during which time one of his own craftsmen from his team was in turn bribed to emigrate to Florence, where he provided the recipe to the Docchia factory. By the early 1740s, however, Dupaquier was deeply in debt, and Maria Theresa agreed to buy him out for over 50,000 florins, making the Wiener Porcelain Manufactory, hereafter, as I said, the WPM, a state firm. In 1744, this investment seemed attractive, both as a means of imperial promotion and a business proposition. The very next year, the WPM moved to cut in on Meissen's Turkish sales by making a self-interested gift of some of its wares to the Ottomans, and in 1749 was rewarded with a large order for the type of wares known as Turkenkopfchen, or Turkish cups. And by 1755, the firm could boast 2 branch shops in Trieste and in Carlsbad. Maria Theresa bought some porcelains, above all to replace the costly sugar sculptures on banquet tables. And here you can see some in this detail of this glorious painting of banquet. And here you see a recreation of those sugar sculptures. Those were replaced by white biscuit porcelains for the most part. But unlike her contemporary, the Madame de Pompadour, Maria Theresa did not make lavish orders from her manufactory. And in fact, the Hof seems to have frequently borrowed porcelain tableware from its manufactory for grand occasions, only paying for pieces when they were chipped or broken. On the whole, the Empress seems to have run a relatively frugal household, though she did enjoy the new taste of coffee and did not mind getting and giving lavish porcelain gifts. When sales plunged during the 7 Years' War, she considered selling the firm, which neither the French nor the Saxons at the time would have ever considered, but no buyer appeared. After the war's end, at a time that Austrian manufacturers in general began to enjoy new prosperity, the WPM rebounded nicely. And by 1775, it had tripled in size to 300 workers, a very large concern at the time. It is doubtful, however, that it actually made much money. That was neither typical nor particularly vital for manufacturers of the sort at the time. Their prestige and their projected future contributions to mercantile success carried them through. We come now, however, to a critical moment in the 1780s, following the highly successful intrusion of Josiah Wedgwood's cheaper fine stoneware into the Central European market. The WPM was running in the red again by 1783, when that efficiency maven and monopoly hater Joseph II tried for a second time to sell it, but again could find no sufficiently well-heeled or foolhardy buyer. This was a critical moment in the history of the ceramics marketplace. A number of other German princely manufacturers foundered in the 1780s, and some closed. Auctions were introduced to clear overstuffed warehouses, and imitations of Wedgwood abounded. To deal with mounting debts, inspectors were hired, and it was now discovered that the industry was characterized by corruption and massive wastage, as poorer mixing, firing, or modeling regularly rendered 30 to 40% of the wares that went from workshop to the kilns unsaleable. Employees regularly pilfered supplies or took home blanks to decorate and sell. Kiln operators used the ovens to toast chicory. Workers abandoned their posts to hunt or carouse. Cameralist discipline was thereafter layered on top of early forms of market discipline, though it was not always very effective. Early as it may seem, and this came as a surprise to me, competition in advertising on price had already begun by the middle of the century in the form of these published price courantes. I can discuss what that means later if you're interested, but already in the middle of the 18th century, these manufactories were trying to undersell one another, at least for some kinds of wares. The highest end luxury makers suffered, and princes began to make something like cost-benefit analyses, although they were frequently cajoled into bailing out their indebted factories. To give just a few examples, the Hoechst manufactory in Mainz, highly respected in the 1760s for its Rococo figurines, in the 1780s had to be bailed out by the Elector. The Elector was probably relieved, in fact, when the army of the Vosges occupied the money pit in 1792, and the works were closed entirely in 1796. In the mid-1780s, a local businessman offered Prince Johann Friedrich of Schwarzburg-Rudolstadt advice on selling his indebted Volkstedt manufactory in terms that seemed to look ahead to a more liberal market. Quote, "If princely operations actually do bring advantages, a rare occurrence, then onerous monopolies arise, which inhibit individual subjects and bring the interests of the prince into unpleasant collisions with the industries of his subjects," end of quote. Prince Johann did sell. He listened to this sage advice and sold to another princeling, who also failed to make the manufactory pay, and in 1799 sold it to two members of the glassmaking Greiner factory, who we will meet later. These private entrepreneurs would keep the Volkstedt manufactory alive under a variety of names for the next 60 years. But back to Vienna. Here, the emperor could not sell the WPM, and thus Joseph did the next best thing. He tried to impose reforms. He appointed Conrad von Sorgenthal, formerly the director of the Linz woolen factory and a Freemason, to oversee the manufactory, promising him 10% of the profits. Like Meissen's director at the time, Sorgenthal resisted already powerful market forces pressing the manufactory to cheapen products and lower prices to compete with lower quality makers. Instead, he imposed what we might think of as cameralist reforms. He introduced more transparent accounting practices so that prices could be properly calculated. He adopted new forms of work discipline. He hired a capable chemist who improved the quality of the porcelain paste and developed new glazes. And unlike Meissen's managers, he moved quickly to adopt Wedgwoodian neoclassical styles, some of which you see here. He met with stiff resistance from some of the firm's artists, but his reforms rescued the manufactory from closure. After 1805, his successor, the new director, had fluent French, which allowed the firm to ingratiate itself with a powerful operator of the Sèvres manufactory, who was, by the way, a trained mineralogist. The WPM actually flourished in the early Napoleonic era, and in 1809, the factory was operating at its peak with 650 workers when war broke out again and French troops occupied Vienna. A rather similar story could be told about the Prussian KPM in the later 18th century, which Frederick the Great himself micromanaged and moved to piecework. After Frederick's death, the manufactory was subjected to a series of cameralist reforms also, which included the ending of forced sales to Jews and the introduction of a new line of cheap and lead-free Gesundheitsgeschirr, or hygienic wares. This line of easy to make and ready and easy to sell products would stabilize the KPM's bottom line into the 1820s and beyond, and probably save it from closure. Returning, however, to the WPM, French occupation dealt the Viennese manufactory a terrible blow. The factory itself now had to pay a monthly tribute to its occupiers, and when Bavaria sided with the French, the Austrians were cut off from their kaolin supply, located in the area of Passau. And kaolin, by the way, is the high quality white clay needed to make porcelain. As the state teetered toward bankruptcy, sales plunged. Workers had to be fired or furloughed and fed at soup kitchens. Like Meissen, the WPM was saved from disaster by the war's end, which brought in its train an end to Austrian prohibition on coffee imports, and more flamboyantly, the Vienna Congress, which brought a glittering array of some 30,000 German, English, Russian, and other noble consumers to the Habsburg capital, and initiated a new round of diplomatic gift giving, including the massive sets of porcelain all the German manufactories made to thank the Duke of Wellington for his services. All seemed in place for a restoration of courtly consumption and the luxury industries that went with it. In 1818, the WPM opened a grand new showroom in honor of its 100th anniversary. Just at the moment it happens when the market began a cataclysmic downward spiral. Already by 1819, profits had fallen to less than 6,000 thaler, about a tenth of which they had been in 1816. A major reason for this was the end of the continental system and the passage of the 1818 Prussian tariff, which permitted a flood of cheap English goods to swamp local manufacturers. This was a blow that took decades or more to recover from, and some industries never did recover, one of which we might argue was the WPM. Porcelain in general suffered in the 1820s. The WPM faced great hardship. Imperial patronage fell off sharply. Even those aristocrats whose fortunes remained secure seemed to have curtailed their lavish meals and entertainments. The firm fell behind in chemical and technical improvements. Having lost its monopoly privileges in 1810, the WPM had increasingly to contend with domestic Bohemian producers, most especially the lower cost, but yet high quality Czech producers at Sorgenthal. Although the WPM, like all the mercantile firms, slashed nominal and real prices, its wares continued to be very expensive. And unlike the Prussians, it had no line of cheap Gesundheitsgeschirr to entice more modest buyers. A goodly number of the well-paid painting staff was fired or their salaries cut, although the WPM painters continued to consider themselves and to dress like artisanal masters. And thanks especially to the master painter Joseph Nigg, the manufactory did continue to keep its reputation for painting, especially for painting flowers. By the 1850s, however, the manufactory was surviving largely on the production of telegraph insulator tubes. In 1862, in the middle of a terrible deflation and fearsome budget deficit brought on by the loss of the Italian provinces and markets, exclusion from the Zollverein and poor harvests, the liberal Reichstag voted to close the manufactory entirely. A successor would only be founded again in 1923. And thus did the proud history of the mercantile WPM reach its dismal end. Was it killed by liberalism? Well, you might say that. Better, in fact, to say that than that it was killed by capitalism. For the Meissen and KPN manufactories continued on through the 19th century and did even manage to profit in many years. The WPM's closure was a political decision, undoing the political decision Maria Theresa made to buy the indebted manufactory more than a century before. So now to our other manufacturing, this one the semi-private firm of Wallendorf, one of at least 13 factories capable of producing hard-paste porcelain of varying qualities in the region of Thuringia by 1800. It's misleading to call these Thuringian firms in their founding years, both because the area of Thuringia didn't exactly exist as such. We're talking about this area of the Saxon principalities. And we can't also really call these private manufactories entirely, as many of them were at least given a helping hand, if not more, by their local princes. This area, in fact, was full of princes, something that made competition more vigorous and also indebtedness more common. At first, these princes seem to have been competing with one another, mostly for prestige, however, rather than for market share. In many cases, they were simply backing the money-making schemes of a favored courtier. But none of these princes had deep enough pockets to sustain major manufactories or domestic courts and markets large enough to sustain an inwardly focused firm. Thus, they and their leaseholders tended to orient themselves much more quickly to export and middling markets and to push down prices as well as raise quantities produced in order to continue operating. They also tended to engage in shady business practices, such as imitating the trademarks of higher quality brands. And you see here a comparison between some of those marks that Wallendorf used, like this one, and the famous crossed swords of Meissen. Perhaps they felt that that was the only way they could compete with firms whose subsidies, protections, and privileges the private makers themselves considered unfair. Many of the owners here were relatives of the patriarch Johann Gottlieb Greiner, himself the offspring of a long line of glassmakers. Artisanal know-how, as well as the pooled family capital they were able to raise, were essentially in making it possible for all of Gotthelf Greiner's sons and several daughters and sons-in-law to make the transition from craftsman to entrepreneur. So these have a very different genesis, even with some princely funding. They come from entrepreneurial foundings by artisans and their backers rather than by state-owned manufactories. It's still rather mysterious how Johann Gotthelf discovered the secret recipe for hard-paste porcelain. His brother's alchemical dabblings had something to do with it, but the rapid spread of the secret through the Saxon principalities around 1760 smells to me of industrial espionage. In any event, with the backing of what we might call a proto-entrepreneur, a capital-rich foundry owner named J.W. Hamann, who happened to be the Greiner's brother-in-law, the Greiner brothers applied for a privilege to make porcelain. In 1764, they convinced Duke Josias of Saxony-Coburg-Saalfeld to allow them to do so in the town of Wallendorf. 8 years later, Johann Gotthelf sold the family shares and began porcelain production at his own glass factory in Limbach. He also took over the lease for the Ilmenau factory, which had just been saved from bankruptcy by the intervention of Goethe and Duke Karl August of Saxe-Weimar-Eisenach in 1786. By the century's end, members of the Greiner factory family owned or operated Wallendorf, Limbach, Ilmenau, Kloster-Waldorf, and Volkstedt factories, although by no means did this make all of them rich or ensure the long-term success of these still fragile private enterprises. The money, J.W. Hamann, the foundry owner, in the meantime operated the factory. And note that it is now not in the hands of craftsmen, but of the money. At Hamann's death in 1772, Hamann's widow, Anna Margareta, born Greiner, took control and kept the Wallendorf firm running until 1811, when her son took over. Statistics show that by the 1790s, the firm employed some 50 workers and was producing more than 1,000 Turkish cups in every firing, and dozens of teapots, saucers, and sugar bowls suitable for smaller budgets. During and after the upheavals of the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars, Wallendorf continued to cultivate export markets for his inexpensive and useful goods. In 1818 alone, it sent 30,000 Turkish cups to Cairo, Aleppo, Jaffa, and Damiette. In 1829, Anna Margareta's heir leased the Wallendorf manufactory to another relative, Johann Heinrich Hutschenreuter, the father of Carlos Magnus Hutschenreuter. This latter Hutschenreuter had to battle local iron makers to obtain sufficient wood supplies and paternalist local officials who didn't want him to lose his shirt. Even as his inexpensive wares, pipes, teacups, doll heads began to sell in German and Near Eastern markets, Hutschenreuter faced political, technical, and material difficulties in scaling up production. And when he died in 1845, leaving his wife, Johanna, to manage the firm, the business was really only beginning to thrive with about 50 to 60 workers. It would only be after the 1850s that Hutschenreuter would become a name to conjure with. But by the time of the WPM's closure, both the CM Hutschenreuter and the branch Lorenz Hutschenreuther firms would be booming, and they would continue to do so into the 1980s. They now belong to a conglomerate called BHS Tabletop, so in some sense they are still alive. The Wallendorf Hutschenreuter story tells us a tale of a slow, punctuated private entrepreneurial success. We must not forget that most of such businesses failed entirely and are lost to history. But its success does tell us something about Central European business history in the Sattelzeit, a subject that is otherwise rather hard to access. If we look across the industry as a whole in the crucial decade of the 1820s, we can see that these were hard for all, but perhaps especially hard for high-end state makers, many of them starved, like the WPM, of state patronage and aristocratic purchases. For smaller makers, capital formation was difficult and sales sluggish. Scaling up production took ingenuity, especially as it had to be done with chemistry and smaller labor-saving devices, rather than with the much too costly steam engines. But it could be done, and demand for cheaper luxury goods was growing, if modestly. In 1830, according to one estimate, 62 private porcelain manufactories were operating in the area Bismarck would later unify. By 1850, the recently consolidated fine earthenware firm of Villeroy and Bosch could boast 1,825 employees, many of them women. In the wider Germanosphere, too, entrepreneurs entered the market in large numbers. By the 1840s, there were at least 73 ceramics factories in the Habsburg lands, 29 of them in Bohemia alone. The Bohemian industry in particular was flourishing. In 1828, Schlagenwald employed 100, Ellbogen 60, Gieshubel 30 to 40, and Dahlwitzer stoneware nearly 90. As a price list attached to one of these memos showed, the latter firm not only had commissioned agents in Austria's major cities, but also in numerous smaller towns. F.A. Schumann in Moabit near Berlin and the Czech entrepreneur Josef Hartmuth, also the inventor of the graphite pencil, would also make their fortunes in this lower end market. To compare porcelain manufacturing and typical manufacturers in the 1770s and in the 1830s is to find a world of difference. While it is true that already in the earlier period, a number of firms produced cheaper faience or majolica alongside costly porcelains, in general, porcelain production in the 1770s and 80s was intended for wealthy members of court. At the time in Northern Germany in particular, the consumption of coffee and its substitutes was sharply rising, despite in some places bans on lower class coffee consumption. Over the next decades, an increasing number of wealthy households exchanged silver, pewter, and earthenware pots and cups for breakable, fashionable porcelain. As a Dutch scholar has recently pointed out, this was a sign that consumers had begun to think of housewares not as multi-generational holders of value, as refundables, but as items of fashion. Still, we're dealing here mostly with northern, urban, relatively wealthy consumers, or Viennese consumers, and manufacturers thought of themselves as supplying mostly their betters, who wanted lavish table services for 100 people, as intricate and useless figurines or giant swan-shaped tureens. Upper middle class consumption was growing by the century's end, that is to say, but by no means was it yet shaping the marketplace, as Maxine Berg has argued for England. In the 1820s and 30s, by contrast, cameralist practices have been further stiffened by post-Napoleonic market discipline. For state-run industries, finance ministries began to tighten bottom lines, which meant that in many manufactories, the artisans were replaced as managers with trained chemists, who also saw to the limiting of wastage in materials, the addition of new labor-saving technologies, such as transfer printing, and the consequent firing of many porcelain artists. Never again highly respected sculptors or painters would work in the porcelain manufactories, though they would sometimes be commissioned for designs. As guilds gave way to Gewerbeverein, one sees the evolution from privileges to patents, a move that rewards not craftsmen, but machine builders, and has as its aim the ever-increasing efficiency of production as opposed to the constraint of other makers. Although we have no time today for such peripheral subjects, we could also mention here the enormous surge in artificials and surrogate technologies in this period, which include Hartmut's graphite, but also the use of metal oxides for many paints and glazes, the development of artificial soda, bleach, sulfur, wax, and veneer. Semi-artisanal chemical innovations allowed for the scaling up of production and the massive cheapening of soaps, candles, rubber products, matches, and furnishings. Pressing, slip casting, and transfer printing made possible the great cheapening of glass and ceramics of all kinds. We find for sale not only plaster or bronze busts and figurines, but imitation marbles, artificial flowers, and faux pearls. Most of these goods were not produced as identicals, but in batches with many styles, colors, and variations possible. Of course, textiles too were falling in relative price. Almost everything seems to have done so, with the crucial exceptions of food and rent. This seems to be a story about the Industrial Revolution we don't know very well at all, but one which shows how Central European manufacturers took advantage of market niches to produce semi-luxury and semi-mass-produced goods such as ceramics, pencils, hats, playing cards, buttons, and ribbons, and in the process laid the foundations for new ways of life. This was the form of production that drove out, or at least diminished and turned into an avant-garde art market, older forms of luxury production. Rather than, or rather before, the coming of the machine age, this, I would argue, is how mercantilism gave way to a freer, though never fully free, marketplace in consumer goods. Before I close, I want to just offer a few brief illustrations of the transformations I've just described as we move from the market of the 1770s to the market of the 1830s. If we look at some of those gallantry wares produced in the late 18th century, we see these specialty goods, many of them commissioned and very specific, many of them highly labor intensive, and many, many figurines, a sort of archetypical production of the later 18th century. By the 1830s, on the other hand, gallantry wares had become a small portion of even the luxury makers' lists, and private producers had mostly stopped making figurines entirely. What they produced instead were porcelain pipe heads by the thousands, many of them with very intricate and often personal decorations. They had also begun producing something called a lithophane, a kind of transparent porcelain screen which depicted a scene or famous painting when set up in front of a candle or gas lamp. There were also many more hygienic wares, including chamber pots and basins and ewers, but the main part of production had shifted to coffee and tea wares and to plates. The shift to more ordinary wares, however, did not mean that the manufacturers produced only a few designs or shapes. On the contrary, the sort of batch production used by these manufactories allowed them to vary the colors and decor very widely indeed, and to cater to customers' desires. Blue and white transfer printing made also for much variety. Those who paid for premium prices for all colored wares had almost infinite choice of designs and colors, and many specially ordered pieces were produced, which included things like battle plans and special dedications or birthday wishes inscribed on these plates. This is not what we think of as mass production. Something important, however, had happened to give middle-range consumers more choice and more impact in the luxury market. And it's not what we would call feudalization. Perhaps we need to take Biedermeier culture more seriously, and especially take the market for semi-luxury goods more seriously if we want to understand some of these social and cultural transformations in the years before the railways and great exhibitions began to exert their accelerating effects. When we leave this story about 1840, we find the WPM still operating, though embarked on its sickness unto death. We find the private manufactories beginning to hum and to produce a wide range of semi-luxury wares for a new world of consumers, such as those on view in this image of a Leipzig cafe around 1844. This was not yet a mass market, perhaps, but one that is widening, if even still frail, and retarded in its growth by the economic crises of the 1840s and again in the 1860s. I would not call Central Europe industrialized at this point, or at least not in its common sense, invoking the shift to machines and mass-produced wares. Consumption of even minor luxury goods remained weak and production local, or at least semi-artisanal. But something has happened, both to producers and consumers. And in the book, I tell the story of what is happening to laborers, which is definitely not a success story. But is anything ever a success story in the history of the modern economy? Briefly, perhaps, but often not for long. It is one of the lessons I've learned in the course of this project, that no product, and perhaps especially no luxury good, is popular forever. The market is indeed fickle. But so too are rulers and perhaps people in general. And it's our job and our delight to discover just how and why we change our tastes and our manufactures, perhaps in part to appreciate too just how frail and fleeting the success stories of today may soon seem. Few of us buy or use porcelain anymore, but I hope this tale will convince you that it too has a history worth telling. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Sue. What a wonderful and beautiful tour that you took us through this really incredible and very, very important moment between the late 18th century and the early 19th century in this critical period of transition. You touched on, that was heavy and a lot in there, and really some great themes. And I'm wondering if perhaps best now just to open things up to our audience and what questions they might have, asking you to perhaps elaborate on things that you just touched on in passing that I'm sure you can go in at greater depth. And perhaps my colleagues can help me too as we kind of monitor. Let's see, are others who want to ask something? I see a hand. Gunther Bischoff, please.
Yeah, hi, good to see you, Howard. Hi, Sue. Thank you for a wonderful talk. When you told me years ago you were working on porcelain, I had no idea what it was about. What I find out now is, at least according to today's talk, it's mainly business history. So have you turned a business historian? I expected something more cultural in terms of the aesthetics.
Yes, thank you.
My other question is, why the Wiener Porzellan Manufactory and not Augarten? Because usually we would associate Augarten with Viennese production. Thank you.
Thank you, Gunther. Wonderful to see you. I didn't expect to become a business historian. The reason I got into the subject was I hoped that I could use the styles of porcelain to try to do a kind of cultural analysis of the distribution of Oriental versus classical and other kinds of images through the 19th century. And I discovered I couldn't really do that very well. There's no very easy way to count them, although I did find some price lists of special items that allowed me to do a little bit of that. But where I found the story was in the business end. And this was something that I think the museum folks who do such a wonderful job with the curating of the pieces and who know so much about the artists don't care so much about, and perhaps they can't care so much about it because they need to be interested in the most beautiful objects and those that make the best display. But the business side just entranced me more and more, and I found I could trace all sorts of stories by taking it in this direction. So that's how I ended up as a business historian, which I also never intended to do, although I have been feeling the pull of the economy more and more. Maybe it's the 2008 downturn that made us all feel like that was something to pay greater attention to. As far as Allgarten, that is the reinvented successor of the WPM. In 1923, Allgarten was founded using the old models of the WPM. So it's effectively a continuation, although not continuous, obviously. And it is reinvented itself as the successor, but there's a long break in between.
Thank you. I think we have a hand from William Kettle and then Catherine Ahrens.
So you mentioned that the Meissen factory that's still in operation today is mercantilist and that it's owned by the state. Is that owned by the Saxony state or is it by the federal German government?
Yes, William, it is owned by the Saxons, by the
Okay.
Saxon state. It became a Saxon state institution in 1833, I think it is, 32, 33, just at the point of the transition to the Zollverein.
Mhm.
And no longer a royal imperial manufactory, but a state-owned industry. It survived as a state-owned industry right through the DDR, producing 18th century models for export, and it's continued to be supported. It is now in deep, deep debt, and so the Saxon Landtag considers virtually every year what to do about it. And I can't imagine they're going to close it. It's too much of a cultural institution, but it is in terrible debt.
Thank you. We have Professor Ahrens from Texas.
Unmute, that's the problem. Okay, the question I've got is, you're talking about theft of industrial espionage, but what about the relation of the chemistry to like the other state investments? Because part of this is you need to have a chemical industry, which goes along with armament industries, which goes along. So I'm wondering if you found any links on that, because this is the era when universities are being founded or expanded as well.
It's an excellent question, Catherine. I am now in hot pursuit of some of this chemistry stuff. I'm really interested in the way in which professional chemists, that is university trained chemists, become part of this industry and become the managers of it in the 1820s for sure, and in Paris before that. It becomes crucial to have somebody who's not just a kind of good artisanal chemist, but somebody who is actually a trained university chemist who knows principles and generalities. So by the 1820s, for sure, those people are operating, but there's a prehistory. Some of these chemistry labs in the manufactories are actually places of research for other things, especially for dyes. That's a big one. But in fact, the great Berlin chemist, I'm now blanking on his name. I'll think of it momentarily, begins with K, actually does some of his experiments which end with the discovery of uranium in the KPM manufactory. And so there are all sorts of links. Mineralogy is also deeply linked, obviously, because you need to know where the mineral deposits are and be able to analyze what clay is best. So all of these early sciences definitely play in. One of the people who was involved, in fact, in the discovery of the secret recipe was a man named Ehrenfried Tyrnhaus, who was a man of many different scientific proficiencies, but one of them was mineralogy and another was heat technology, the use of burning mirrors to make for extreme heats. So this is another piece of the puzzle too, is you need to know how to make the kiln work properly and fire at the right temperature. And as you say, it's the same in the armaments industry. these things are closely interlocked. Those people who know how to use heat technology are in the porcelain industry. They're also in the armaments industry. They're also in the glass industry. And there's a lot of technology transfer between these different industries in the 18th century, which is crucial for the development of all of those firms.
And I think the other thing is you part of it, the family enterprise, because that's the Wedgwood story, but they kept their labs. England wasn't interested in chemistry at that point, past a certain point. But then I think the other thing you're saying also in, let's see, The Hare with the Amber Eyes, that porcelain, the fellow who wrote it is a potter, is a porcelain manufacturer, and he also stresses the heat technologies as being really critical.
Right. Porcelain, I didn't give you the sort of introductory bits about porcelain as opposed to other ceramics, but that's important. It's the highest grade of ceramics, and it's fired at the highest temperature of any. So it's very tricky. It requires very careful both shaping and also firing in order for it to come out of the kiln, you know, without breakages or chips or fragments or what am I trying to think of?
And color changes and things like that.
The colors change, and so it takes a great deal of control of both chemical elements and of heat to make it successfully.
Thank you.
Thanks. Maybe I can sneak a question in real quickly. You did a very nice job in terms of framing your story or your presentation today between this contrast between the WPM and Wallendorf. But presumably, of course, it's far more complicated than that. And one of the things that you really didn't say much about, but I would guess that this is having an impact on how the industries in Central Europe are developing, are the exports coming in. You mentioned the Dutch at the beginning as playing the middleman and bringing the Chinese goods in particular in. How does that, as an extra factor, this sort of outside competition, have an impact shaping and shifting and molding the market?
Excellent and complicated question, as you say, Howard. One of the reasons that the Europeans were so anxious to get the recipe for East Asian porcelain was that there was an interruption in the market in the late 17th century. There was turmoil in China after the Qing came to power. Many of the manufactories there stopped producing or couldn't get goods out. And this created a kind of pressure on prices and also shortage of supply in Europe. That was one reason Tschirnhaus was already trying to make porcelain, and they were definitely trying to make porcelain, hard paste porcelain in France in the late 17th century before the Meissners succeeded in making it. So there was already, you know, a kind of desire to cut into that East Asian market and compensate for its deficient production at the moment of its invention. Throughout the 18th century, there continues to be porcelain coming in from East Asia. It increasingly is in competition with local faience, which is a kind of stoneware. It's a high quality, but not as high quality as porcelain form of ceramics, and stoneware, which is a cut below that, and earthenware, which is cut below that. So there are many different kinds of ceramics available. East Asian porcelain is bought in large quantities, but it does cost a premium in Central Europe because it goes through Dutch hands. And that means that it's extra expensive for them. So gradually, homegrown or German made porcelain gets the upper hand, in part also because it's made in styles that are more in tune with European tastes. It's also the case that by import and export, we get very complicated because everybody within each of these little Central European states has their own tariffs. So everybody tries to shut out the Saxons, for example. So they consider export, just to other German states a success because they manage to make a premium that way. But it is a very complicated market. It's the English, however, who really pose this terrible problem in the 1780s, Wedgwood in particular, but also others who are making now cheaper forms of high quality ceramics, not just porcelain. Wedgwood actually didn't make porcelain, it made fine stoneware. But it's beautiful stuff and it was much cheaper. That's where the German high quality manufactories really had trouble competing, was with those English makers. And Sèvres in Paris also began to produce extremely high-end wares. So for very elite buyers, Sèvres became also a competitor. So it becomes just a free-for-all by the later 18th century, we could say, with all of those parties in the market. But you're right, of course, I just picked two to kind of juxtapose. And I didn't pick Meissen because everybody tells the Meissen story. And so I wanted to give you different take in, and also to get in an Austrian firm for all of us who are big on Austrian history.
Well, we thank you. We appreciate the we appreciate the nod to Austria in particular. Thanks. We have a question from Don Wallace. I can read it, but Don, do you want to just unmute yourself and jump in?
Sure. Sorry, I just don't know how to raise my hand on Zoom. We use Google Meet. So hi, Sue, thank you for the talk. It was really interesting. And my question is more from a teaching point of view than a research, since I don't work in this period. But I've always thought of the issue, the strange issue of demand in the Atlantic system and in the relationship of capitalism as a kind of development of commodification of culture, consumer culture, and whether that demand stretches deeper, lower into society and sets up the kind of demand to find efficiency and industrialization, that is an Atlantic world development. And your story here has a move from courtly market into a lower level market by the mid 19th century. And I'm just curious about cause and effect, whether you see this as the manufacturers building this market, or that this is somehow a importation of consumer culture.
Excellent question, Dawn. Good to see you.
Yeah.
I would say this. So I was frustrated when I first started this project by the lack of secondary material that would really help me very much with some of the questions I had. I've subsequently found there was more than I thought there was, but there's really not that much that gives you a good picture of consumption across the classes in the later 18th and early 19th century for Central Europe. That contrasts very sharply with what we have for England or for France. And I think then historians tend to assume that Central Europe is just the same. And I just don't think that's the case. It lags behind in many ways. People are poorer. They don't have the disposable income until later. I think that I can say with fairly good confidence. Food and textiles begin to show signs of increasing in consumption in the later 18th century, but it's slow, and it's not the same as you get in the British Isles. So what I think happens, and actually it's the story can be told from either direction, and this is part of the complicated Central European story. That is, those manufacturers like Wallendorf are indeed actually responding to demand. They see that people will buy stuff that is in their price range. They find a market niche and they work at that market niche. They sometimes try to get a little more refined and produce higher quality things, but mostly they go for the middle of the road. The state manufacturers have to be forced there. They believe they are producing art. They are producing, in their view, for the aristocratic classes. And it's only in the 1820s, under the pressure of the finance ministries, that they are forced to produce stuff that can be sold more broadly. It is not what they want to do, and they do it most unwillingly. So it's both, and that's what I tried to hint in the paper, that there's cameralist discipline going on. That is the state coming in and saying, you have to do this. We have to be more efficient. You have to care about the market. That is one kind of discipline, and the market has another kind of discipline. And those two, by the 1820s, are hand in hand, pushing these manufacturers to do something else and to diversify. There's a final, everything gets complicated when you start looking at it. There's a final piece, which is that those state manufacturers do still have to continue producing high quality wares, because that's their brand name. Meissen can't just totally sell out and start producing cheap teacups, or it's not Meissen, and they're never going to do it as cheaply as Wallendorf. So they can't actually abandon some of the high level production. So they're caught between these two things, commerce or artistry. And that will characterize the whole rest of their history, is trying to please both masters, as it were. And the state just keeps saying to them, why don't you behave more like a business? And they keep saying, because we're not a normal business. Something that reminds me of our arguments within universities these days. The university says to us, why don't you behave about a bit like a business? And we say, because we're not a normal business. It's something of that same contradiction that we've got going on.
Thank you. One thought that may be way out of bounds on this is, can this be traced in any way to the kind of development of the marginal theories within economics about 2 decades later, that these ideas are becoming theoretical within Austrian and German economics, or at least being argued, maybe not becoming central?
Yeah, I just don't know, Don. I mean, that would be interesting to know. I have seen with my own eyes, I find it very interesting how much more the bureaucracy, the finance ministry, gets involved in these debates and asks for figures and cost breakdowns by the 1820s anyway. And so they are certainly beginning to really take such things seriously, whether or not they do so from a real, trained and systematic economic perspective, or just because they think it's inefficient and they want to clean it up. I don't know.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Don. Do we have any further questions here? I mean, there's been so many, you've really strategically loaded your presentation today with so many teasers. I think it's all encouraging us to buy the book to get the fuller answers, the fuller story to this very nice way to just highlight some of the key themes. But have I missed anybody for any final questions or thoughts? Don't see anything. And if that is the case, I think we should all come together and thank Professor Marchand for joining us today, and for this really wonderful presentation that helps us think about industrialization, not just with the big stuff, but also with the little stuff too, these luxury goods. Really wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Howard. It's been delightful to talk to all of you. Thank you for your questions, and have a great rest of the semester.